Hello everyone, today we talk about the relation between Otto III, Rome and Constantinople during the reign of the first. In the first years of Schwerpunkt I made multiple videos about the Ottonian Empire, the Ottonian dynasty, the single figures Otto the First, the Second, the Third, Henry II, and you know that there is a pretty hefty medieval Germany and Holy Roman Empire playlist. And we also talked a lot about Byzantine history, but we rarely observed this trait d'union that Otto III represents in a symbolical way, and also the history of the papacy that we will see in parallel at some other point, in the history of the city of Rome, that, as we have seen, also deserves an important consideration, for I have created a playlist specifically dedicated to it. In the what was in fact thought or aimed at, in part still believed and perceived as the overlapping of, or better, the subsistence of a single Roman Empire still to this point. I have discussed ad nauseam the entire issue of the Universal Imperium, or how still in fact in early or high medieval times people really saw the Romanity, the Christianity, the Catholicity of the empire all over Europe, that there wasn't really a divide apart. Nobody had thought that the Roman Empire had ended. You see easily certain YouTube channels that even unbeknownst to themselves make videos like, when did the Roman Empire fall? When did they realize it did? And this kind of Soviet way of making history. Let's look at the statements of single people and try to figure out. Like, if you haven't entered yet in that kind of of mindset of frame, even just through the history of the imperial ideology, or even juridical history in a sense, but just banally what these emperors were claiming themselves and the popes were supporting in, because telling the truth, St. Peter's successors were actually exploiting skillfully this idea that they controlled practically both the East and the West in the process, because nor the Ottonians nor the Byzantines had practically the capacity of having a united empire. And there was actually bitter hostility and conflictuality among all these players, right? For many reasons. There are both the contrast between universal powers, between the two empires that are claiming it, but the same Roman Church, and the difference between that and the Roman nobility, the perception, we'll see it now in the various parts of the empire. And what was this empire? Right, because nobody had really outlined a boundary, as eventually we think, with Otto I, the Holy Roman Empire is born. It's the same Holy Roman Empire that always existed since the dawn of Rome. And we will see it with Boleslav of Poland as well, that was even crowned as a sort of imperial twin by Otto III in person. And we will see how this, today we will look mostly at the cultural influence that the Byzantine imperial ideology had in Ottonian policy, and how especially Otto III looked at the Romano-Italic background of his, in fact, imperium from an ideological point of view, and how the Germans received this, how the Byzantine Italians, by the way, received this, because the empire, the Byzantine Empire was still present in the peninsula, and you understand that Rome was a bit the cornerstone of those world systems. So just ideologically, now I think I'm stating the obvious, right? But I don't see in popular culture nowadays anybody hearing about these very phases or periods. What people want to hear is just, again, some kind of cartoonish type of this emperor conquered this and defeated that, and this battle squeeze like in 3 minutes to show some pictures taken from Osprey and so on. But at the end of the day, history is not that, and I speak it from probably one of the single most hardcore military historical backgrounds, meaning that's the only thing I study at the end of the day. I'm not an expert in political history or whatever, if not through, in fact, this awareness that I matured about universal tradition, about the Clausewitzian theory, and how this is, in fact, declined in these issues. And the thing that strikes me the most, telling the truth, is how even very advanced historiography, while aware of the symbolical dimensions, the say what even more ancestrally all this displays of power could mean, right, in the ways were laid out, they don't really focus too much on the properly on that moral dimension that you can measure politically, socially, among the various players, saying why did, say, this people behave like this here. And then it's interesting also because in a history like the Ottonian one, it's very easy to compare. This was a universal empire, so it encompassed very different peoples. They had different backgrounds, and they saw these things in different ways. And there are many other, names we will make, from Sylvester II to Saint Nilus, etc., that we have. Okay, Germanic we have discussed, but this, for example, this Byzantine Italy at the times, but in high medieval times, made multiple videos about early medieval Byzantine Italy specifically, but just generically. So at some point we'll have to descend gradually, right, and overflow kind of YouTube with this kind of content. And I hope that all these videos kind of pave the way to each other, right? My dream is people watching playlists, yes, but sometimes even thanks to the suggested videos, kind of stumbling some other content I made that the tags connect, etc. Because it's just huge. It's just an enormous net, and the more you study, especially medieval history, the more you realize how all interconnected the system really was, right? How the concept that people didn't travel, didn't know, whatever, doesn't have the slightest foundation, and it's just a product of, again, a modern secular thought that says, oh, look, everything was kind of fragmented, so we have to think it was just bad people didn't travel. No, it was a universal empire, right? And in many ways, there always is in history, and you just don't see it, or you don't want to see it, because this specific concept has been ideologically removed, cancelled, eliminated, obscured in any possible way by say most historiography, let's put it this way, but I'm not going to digress on this issue, like, important. So, what's the context here? It's the Renovatio Imperii, and the blend that occurred biologically, and not only, between the Germans and the Byzantines. The ruling dynasties married to each other. Specifically, Otto II married Theophano, who was a Byzantine princess. She wasn't so prestigious as she sounds, because she was just the relative of an usurper, and later the Macedonians that were still formally in charge in Constantinople, and naturally the Komnenians, etc., wouldn't basically recognize this thing, also because the Ottonians went extinguished in the first place. But as you know, the Byzantines tried always not to provide the Westerners with any possible, let's say, opportunity to claim the Romanity of the empire, because the Byzantines wouldn't recognize it. Said legalistically that the Romanity of the empire was a matter of, Roman statalism at that point in their culture, and decided to ignore what was happening in the West, or at least dismissing it, right? Even recognizing the Imperial, but not recognizing the Romanity, that is to say, the Catholicism and the absoluteness of the empire itself, that was, however, still being shared and broken. And again, I have made a playlist which is known as Renovatio Imperii. So if you're not familiar with this concept, there is a lot in that. There is a lot of it also in the European history religion playlist. And if you there are also some Holy Roman Imperial history videos that are pretty vocal about this in different eras, but I covered in general also the wall. So there was naturally a flow of Byzantine artifacts through the magnificent dowry that Theophano brought from Constantinople, which for 10th century Germany was a big deal, right? Even in this sense, always remember that this post-Roman Europe had remained by far the most culturally advanced in the continent, and from Rome, from Constantinople, there are literal waves of kind of civilization that keep expanding towards the north and so on. So at this point, of course, Germany had been conquered by the Carolingians. It was Christian. The Ottonians had literally resumed the imperium, as at least they had managed to secure the Italic kingdom, again from Germany, which was a bit of a novelty because the center of Frankish power had historically laid more west, right? And so, until the 19th century, actually, this axis would remain standing, and that's the reason why we improperly differentiate kind of the Holy Roman Empire, which was not even called like that immediately, like this, nor of course distinguished conceptually, because to them it would have not made sense from the Carolingian one. But it established a series of relations between Central Europe and the Mediterranean that encompassed also the obvious aim of reestablishing the empire from Rome as a capital, reuniting Eastern and Western empires, we can call it this way, hopefully controlling the papacy that was the one now to confer traditionally the imperial crown, at least in the Western tradition, and to essentially represent what was, in fact, still more evidently probably at the time than today, the preferential place from which to rule the world, right? The Mediterranean, right, with a control on continental Europe, North Africa, the Levant, and so on. So exactly what the Romans had originally done. And I will not digress now on the prestige that the Roman Church per se had, because we will be talking about Byzantine influence. But as we will see, most of this actually came from within the same Italian territory, not much from Constantinople, as a matter of fact. And in this, one has always to look at the overlapping on these spheres of influence, like essentially an Italian north supporting the Ottonians, the papacy in central Italy that was essentially already claiming its own, and especially with Sylvester II, and importantly because of this imperial universal Ottonian ideology, would resume properly the idea of being of needing actually a purification, which was the same identical language the Ottonians used to justify the appointment of popes of their, essentially, they were their faithful clients, and a southern Italy that was in part controlled by the Byzantines, in part was essentially the remnants of the Longobards, and that was suffering also Saracen raids. And that was thus so diversified that for the sake of an imperial policy, the goal was of course taking it over entirely, because already the Italic kingdom tradition stressed that, like, as literally Regis Totius Italia, the idea that all the peninsula had some sort of unitary direction, and the way this tripartition had, if we can even speak of this, which is somehow inaccurate, but for the sake of approximation, was a direct consequence, of course, of the limits of all these powers in a way or another, right? That we will also not discuss today, but we will have to make a beautiful video about the entire kind of 10th century Italy, because it's first of all, it's much more messed up that it even sounds. But at the same time, you understand that this was the cradle of enormous ferments that just in the following century would have brought to the resuming of Roman law, the Italian communes, the maritime republic. So something that at every political, military, and social level, was one of the most impressive dynamics, not just in the Middle Ages, but beyond. And so understanding what the Universal Empire, in which most of these lands would remain, in the influence, in fact, on their mentality, on their mindset, on their experience of what they had to cope politically, institutionally, juridically, culturally with, is of incredible importance. So when you look at the influence that especially Theophanus Dowry may have had in Germany, you must look at, in fact, local art during the 10th, the 11th century, mostly present today in the German cathedral treasuries and museums. If you tour Germany, you find beautiful example, exactly this period of Ottonian art that was in fact so splendid because it was so ideological, right? It was the Saxon Ottonians that for the first time resumed in a purified sense properly the concept of the Romanity of the empire, right? For the Carolingians it was still about the Franks, right? And there was some Saxon that also in Ottonian times said, but telling the truth, it's us the Saxons who did this, even though they hardly controlled even the half of Germany, and also the Italian policy was carried out mostly through the support of the cities, of the bishop counts with all, again, the aforementioned limits, and yet the Romanity as the Catholic, that is universal power, so much for the mark that Rome had left dramatically on the imperium per se, what was the universal imperium per se, what the imperium was believed by any people, even before the Romans took it over. Stress, of course, the radical, visceral, vital connection of the imperial dynasty with Rome, and also, of course, the competition that this entailed with Constantinople, right? I made a video, I think it was about Louis de Piers, in which, and others, also about Carolingian Italy, in which we have seen how the Byzantines had said, well, ever since Charlemagne, like, Rome is lost, right? Even though they would always keep playing with the popes politically until the 12th century for a realistic possibility of maintaining a substantial, not just substantial foothold in Italy, but literally the churches united, right? Which at this time they still were, by the way. You realize that the Ottonians needed not just a recognition from Constantinople that Theophanus and Otto II's marriage had accomplished by a certain degree, as we were saying before, but also that they needed to adopt part of that Constantinopolitan ideology, and proving at the same time certain aspects were specific of the Romano-Germanic identity that we also have analyzed so often, and it's probably one of the single most overlooked aspects of this all, especially when people approach it from a Byzantine perspective, saying like this was like was all a scam, it's not true, there weren't Romans, just the Byzantines were. I made multiple videos about this, when you realize it's not obvious at all for the very hardcore beliefs revolving around the Imperium, and the same Roman one, as a matter of fact. So always remember, simple means hard, not easy, right? If it's simple and easy, it means likely that you haven't done your homework, and unfortunately that's the most common, of course, necessity at some point, because we can't even cover everything. I know terribly few That's at least what I feel every day, the more I read and learn about this all. So what you realize from all these beautiful German treasuries is that the Byzantine stuff arrived in Central Europe through a variety of routes, right? Not merely from Theophanes Sumptuous dowry. The important about this, though, is that the emperor was still the medium, right? The one who would properly redistribute these works of art that were, in part, they were all revolving around the sacred symbology of the empire, so they could fit different purposes that were kind of spiritual and temporal alike. And of course, Germany was. I made a video at least about Conrad II, just a little bit after this period. So if you want to have an overview on what Germany was in practice and how it was administered and who was in charge, the elites, etc., you realize that, of course, the land was, first of all, very private in power, in the nature of power. It was pretty much, say, even though Germany was not as feudal as France, it was pretty much elite run, right? Most people were somebody else's, right? And the autonomy of the various so-called ethnic duchies was, however, not a popular thing. It was the local aristocracy that had systematically subjugated the freemen. In this sense, paradoxically, by this point, there was a much greater traditional freedom in the, say, cities of the Italic kingdom, as opposed to the countrysides of the of Germany at that point. So the imperial authority there was thus very felt because Germany, as you know, didn't quite have a real eastern frontier, right? Even with the West, there were some, with Western Francia, there were some issues. And the concept of imperium was much closer to the roots because the country was pretty warlike. Up to Otto I, Otto III's grandfather, as you know, the country had been ravaged by the Magyars. It was pretty militarized, and the people were habituated to this kind of instability, broadly speaking. So the idea of the great comitatus leader that the emperor could embody, this idea of the loot or distribution, properly, in fact, of an imperial scope of the entire monarchy, was deeply felt, and the Byzantine artifacts could boost it further from an ideological point of view. So that the Ottonians had the monopoly on such Byzantine artifacts distribution, and receiving it was just a proof of partaking in fact, this Roman Empire, according to the Latin concept of the munus, of the reward. Of course, this existed in the Germanic equivalent in the same identical traditional way. So, especially during the empire, it's obvious that the nobility made some important leap forward, because it wasn't anymore just like Western Francia per se. It was now a power of at least universal ambition, and surely of international breadth, as you understand. Some of the works that we get from the East having an important symbolic function, right? Aside from the show off, the display, the wealth per se. For example, Otto II is famous is shown on a famous ivory that I often upload in videos about the Ottonians. Uploaded also here. That is typically Byzantine in art, but it was actually probably at least Italian carved. Today it's preserved at the Musée de Cluny. And it represents a perfectly Byzantine scene, right? If you didn't know that was Otto, you would think this is just it's like a Byzantine emperor with his wife, right? They're both wearing an imperial laurus, which was one of the single most identificatively Byzantine clothes, essentially a magnificently embroidered pendant sash, right? Also impractical, probably, but still making a great effect. Plus, of course, other ornamented vestments. Surely there was all a meaning attached at the time. It was known in detail. Today we can just partly reconstruct, but the evidence there is clear, right? These people were considered to be the golden race of the gods that were ruling the universe. And in the way, of course, Byzantine art had somehow sanctioned this in a kind of crystallized, universal, solemn ritual, even frightening way, as we'll see further. Theophano, that appears, of course, in the ivory, also wears Byzantine imperial vestments, and the couple are being crowned by Christ with stemmata that are crowns. And the meaning here is also crucial, right? The imperium is being conferred to them, or at least to Otto, but also to Theophano through Otto, because that's what the traditional view properly of marriage really is, because women cannot hold the imperium. In fact, in Constantinople, I mean, at times with Irene, etc., it was never anything like an empress, because their fulfillment is receiving it just through the men, as their nature could not, like, let's say it's the man possession of the woman that achieves the imperium per se, right? And the woman is, of course, the opposite of the martial Apollonian Uranian dimension that, in fact, manages to seize the earth, the feminine, the fertile, and so on. Of course, there is always a double analogy there, double threat, but that's how they proceeded. Such depictions were standard in contemporary Constantinople, right? In Germany, they counterbalanced the fact that Theophano had needed to be crowned by the Pope before her wedding to Otto, which was a way to also affirm the Roman primacy, and given that Rome was controlled by the Ottonians, thus the affirmation of what was perceived as the superiority of the West already, even though the imperium was evidently in the hands also of others at the same time. The Byzantine origins of this ivory symbology are spread also through different objects, such as crude lead medallions. There were probably also lots of other representations. Think about all the wax seals and so on, and were probably ignored by most of the Ottonian subjects, especially in Germany, right? Because it was a symbology that didn't have much ground in like the previous kind of Central European reality, and this was much less stratified. The Central European tribes had always been somehow distrustful of a single ruler to could take over everything, just because traditionally they had lacked that possibility themselves. So there was a tension, of course, with the aforementioned ethnic Dutchies, this problem of centralization, but we'll see it better in other videos about Ottonian Germany. However, we're talking just about the majority of the subjects, as we've seen, were basically Serbs, right? They were somebody else's possession in a way. What mattered was who possessed those people, right? That was the political elite. That, as we'll see now, was incredibly receptive, actually, of this imperial ideology. For example, in 984, Gerbert of Rem could assume that the Archbishop Egbert of Trier, so as you know, one of the single most important archdioceses of the empire of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, in that case, too, would be familiar with the Byzantine custom of associating a new man on the throne as a co-emperor, right? The terms as are manor novum, right, and co-emperor as conregnantem, literally. And this derived from the Byzantine habit of not dynasticizing the imperial authority per se. Like the ruling family in Constantinople at some point, in fact, governed for generations, but there was nothing about the blood that was evidenced about that. Because, in a sense, this had to be proven, right? The imperial dignity had to be proven in front of God. But also because the Byzantine Empire wasn't really much of a feudal and thus kind of at least as much of a dynastic system like the Western one was becoming, right? And Germany, as we've seen, was still not even particularly dynastic per se, but rapidly growing in that direction, which was a consequence of the traditionally, again, not much dynastically as we've seen, but still more genetically based, kind of initially clanic based, but then the stock of families we'll see now, based German mentality, and the support that this elected stock had received as for having won the imperium automatically by God. So this was kind of more stressed in a, again, more kind of private idea of power. Again, the Byzantines believed much more in the fact that there was a state, an office, again, a sort of frame within which eventually the emperor would operate to be properly Byzantine, with this incredibly regulated protocol, court etiquette, and so on, the ceremonies, and so on. The Germans were kind of more easygoing and somehow more warlike, or at least, yes, much more connected to that kind of migration era mode attitude that had made them so powerful to be able to literally, even from Saxony, that was kind of probably the most, again, backwards area in the post-Carolingian Empire, but managing to resume power. Right, the Ottonians couldn't boast, even in their origins, kind of gods like through the Merovingians, the Carolingians. They would just have a Saxon rebel and an obscure Carolingian count. So, again, the Frankish count, to say better, from Carolingian times. But they had managed to score this success, and in part because of this kind of crude or more brutal militarization of Saxony that, as you know, had paid in blood the struggle for her independence, and that had fundamentally lost it, but had been, and this was the perception, given that the Ottonians cared a lot about the Frankish grandeur, right? It would be embodied eventually by the Ludolfing, that enormously inherited also the Byzantine symbology of the Ottonians, of the, in fact, the land of the Franks, Franconia, and the military warlike brutality of the Saxons, right? So it was kind of winning combination, and it's not a coincidence that eventually it was this part of Germany that at least initially prevailed, because Franconia at least remained a bit like the center, but as you know, it was mostly southern Germany, was richer, more advanced, that Swabia, mostly that prevailed. Also later, the Habsburgs, but we're talking about much later times. It's so imitatively speaking, you can see that Theophanes' presence had brought, even in the Germanic court, some sort of different political idea regarding, for example, the mediation of imperial power, especially by the same emperors that were, in a Byzantine sense, much more mechanistically capable of deciding who would be in charge or not within the same court, as opposed, again, to most of the Germanic mentality that was, I will win that place on the battlefield, and there is practically no other way to decide it. Needless to say, the Ottonians didn't really have a state, and that's part of the reason why they tried to install one from Italy as opposed to Germany, that of course was less had less potential regarding to this. As we were saying before, what was established by the Ottonians in terms of imperial symbology through this Byzantine influence lives on also in the following centuries. Under the Franconians, it's particularly evident. And this idea, especially of passing down the imperial crown to his chosen son, was at least partly inspired by Constantinople, in a sense, in a more mediated successory fashion. And for a family with pretensions to being the so-called Beata Stirps in Latin, so the blessed family, the emblems of long-established authority were of inestimable value, especially considering that the Ottonian experiment was new, right? Consider that these were, again, the family had made it, but before that there had been a practically, if not an interregnum, but properly the disgregation of the empire, and so many different people claimed the imperium per se. So the need to recompact power, to affirm a new order, a new imperial hierarchy, and so on, was, it reflects ideologically also this constant anxiety for what was happening behind the scenes in practical politics that was a pretty turbulent one, as we will see now. Already Otto II had been more positively interested than his father in the imperial Roman past and its Italian foundation stones, right? Otto I was kind of the typical Germanic leader who didn't have any cultural interest except slaughtering people, right, on horseback, and in the full, again, in the full wake of the Frankish imperial tradition, because that's what you must do. Like, there is no option in this regard. What he managed to forge in blood, establishing this, again, firm stones in Italy, with the papal crowning, the affirmation of this Transalpine prerogative over Italy, naturally opens to all the problems of maintaining politically, administratively, the whole system. And Otto II was already more sensible to this. He, for example, started using in his Italian chancery the title of Imperator Romanorum Augustus from March 982, which naturally is a pretty clamorous and direct inspiration to the Roman model, but strictly meant properly in Rome. And he tried to subjugate Venice as well. That was a Byzantine possession, and aside from the strategic value that its conquest could have provided, it was, of course, an important affront to the same Constantinople, given that Otto II attacked Byzantine Taranto too, right, at yet another important port towards the east and in the deep Italian south. So showing, of course, what the hegemonic objectives of the Ottonians in Italy were, as since kind of Carolingian times it had been evident, and kind of in Constantinople had always been known since the Gothic War, when Franks started launching raids, profiting of the mess and so on. So in this moment of, after all, of recompaction, especially in the second half of the 10th century, of power, broadly meant in the west as in the east, the attrition in the Italian peninsula between the two empires becomes more evident, and thus ideology flares to the Roman papacy acquires an ever greater relevance as a consequence. Otto II was pretty invested also in defending Italy from the enemies of the faith, because the peninsula was under attack of the Saracens. In fact, in the 80s, in the 90s of the 10th century, there had been depredations coming from the southern Italian Saracen posts that were more serious even than the ones of the Fraxinatum Muslims, and that the Byzantines had possibly even contributed to destroy through a naval blockade in 972. I made a couple of videos about the Saracens in general, so if you're interested in Fraxinatum history, the Garigliano mouth. I also made last year a video about Islamic Sicily, so you can find all this stuff, but it's yet another topic that we have to get a bit more in detail. And of course, the sake of an imperator is to win militarily. Otherwise, there is no imperium by definition. And this is why Otto II had invaded Apulia and Calabria, so again the southernmost peninsular lands, trying to eclipse the Basileus as the Relatio Liutprand of Cremona. The imperial Ottonian ambassador Constantinople said as the pallida mors Saracenorum, so the pale death of the Saracens. It was an attribution given to successful Byzantine general of the time against the Muslims in the East. We have seen it also recently in the Byzantine history playlist, Macedonian history, and so on. Because the Byzantine Empire at this point was growing, so Italy was a bit more of a secondary sector theater compared to the Levant at that point, but it was crucial again for ideological reason, for Rome first and foremost. However, as we know, Otto II's army was virtually annihilated by the Saracens in Calabria at the Battle of Cape Colonna. This was a massive disaster, to say the least. A big part of the top German nobility was slain on the battlefield, lay and ecclesiastical lords alike, and the same Otto II managed to escape barely from the Muslims by swimming out literally from the coast to a Byzantine warship that was just anchored offshore, was passing by randomly like that. And the thing should have been like, oh yes, we have saved you because you are, Otto II, we are allies, you have married a Byzantine princess. But Otto understood while he was on board that the Byzantines were basically to kidnap him and to take him as an hostage to Constantinople. So what he actually does is that while he reaches a point of the coast, that was all coastal navigation of the time, he literally jumps off the boat and swims back to the Italian coast, and he manages to escape. But that, if you think about it, could have changed everything, at least in this kind of broader 10th century and beyond. In any case, Otto died precociously, only not even a year and a half later, on December the 7th, 983. And in his burial, you can spot some Byzantine influence because he was laid in an antique sarcophagus beneath a porphyry lid in St. Peter's, Rome, right? And that is quite the thing. Consider that St. Peter's it was the place, of course, where not just it's probably important for the entire Christendom, even though it's not properly the Cathedral of Rome, which is St. John. But it's of course the place of burial of Saint Peter himself in the Vatican necropolis, and so there is also a mentality regarding the closer you are to the center of the world and of sanctity, and the easier your soul can ascend to heaven in the apotheosis in a way. And of course Rome is just the top place for that, in an Augustan perspective. But also there is to consider that St. Peter is the basilica in which the emperors were crowned, and made as such, where Charlemagne had been crowned, and especially he had kneeled on that occasion on a porphyry part of the pavement. So there is there, of course, the purpureal imperial reference, the Augustan dignity, and so on. So you can already spot from Otto III's father how, in fact, the last, at least of the Saxon branch of the Ottonians, could be kind of informed by this experience. There was surely, in fact, a warning also regarding the dangers of imperial policy that derived from Otto's death for his son. And very often we depict Otto III as a guy who was just passively in love with the Roman myth, and that was just advised by this Roman Byzantine background, etc. But it's not entirely true, and there are very interesting signs of a kind of more Germanic identity, or properly Latin Germanic identity at some point, to distinguish it from the Byzantines, in Otto III's Roman ideologism, right? Consider that, again, the empire had to be constantly kept at bay by clashing against this or this other enemy. Consider that the same Germans were a problem, because they were always kind of trying to escape the centralizing policy. The Slavs were on the eastern frontier constantly to pacify. I made a video explaining the dramatic political and strategic importance of that frontier inside. And at this point, because also the Hungarians had been tamed, right, and the same Slavs were realizing that they had to somehow enter a broader circuit of international relations to Christianize, to establish some monarchies. And Otto was, as you know, instrumental in this, both for Stephen of Hungary and Boleslav of Poland. All this in a moment that we also documented in other videos, which Rome and Constantinople were ferociously competing for the Christianization of Central and Eastern Europe, right? And the Romans were actually winning. The Byzantines instead were mostly succeeding just in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe, so in areas that were less important altogether than, say, Hungary or Poland, that were somehow they had more potential and would confer, in fact, an enormous prestige in their Roman Catholicism that also was maintained unwaveringly in an era, again, that before that I made a video about Rastislav of Bohemia, all of Kiev, and so on. But that was not to be given for granted. There were struggles within same, for example, same Bohemia and the same Magyars, were subjugated because eventually they had been defeated by the Ottonians. So they take mostly from the west as opposed to the east, but that passed through a military defeat, right? And so something that was perceived at the time like, whoever defeated us is because he has more imperium than we have, where or another. So we have to watch out, because God rewarded those as opposed to us, and there is something uniquely in that direction we have to take. And kind of in the history of civilization, of course, this was a great step forward. Otto III renowningly showed an unprecedentedly fervent attachment to both the city and the imperial mystique of Rome. Otto III is Rome, right? Much more than any other Holy Roman Emperor, as a matter of fact, because he was factually the only one to rule from there, right, for a time. And this entailed, naturally, a broader, universally hegemonic ideology that fit the inclusion, in fact, of Poland, of Hungary. It was a big feat, right? Because already Germany and Italy were pretty big per se, and Poland and Hungary also were these enormous areas in Central Europe that, of course, could not be directly controlled, but that, bringing within the sphere of the Germanic Empire of the Ottonians was kind of a big deal, and earned also in military power, especially in the eastern frontier, so what the Ottonians had done. However, Otto's tendencies did not appear all at once, right? There wasn't even a compactly unitary and perfectly coherent ideology about this all. There were lots of backs and forths about certain aspects of it, at least because, as we'll see now, the imperial policy was quite strained by internal revolts, even in Rome, and of course different tensions within the same subjects in Germany because of this Byzantine institutional models, etc. For example, his own Byzantine marriage was likely the initiative of his advisors to strengthen ties with Constantinople. And remember again that Roman policy in this sense is very interesting because there were always two factions, like one pro-Germanic, the other pro-Byzantine, on the side of the Roman nobility that played very shrewdly in this international scenario from the city for what, of course, it represented as the seat of papal power and thus of the crowning, the imperial crowning. Consider that Otto III's marriage arrives only 4 or 5 years after his mother's death in 991. So Theophanes' presence was, in a sense, necessary even to boost a bit that kind of Byzantineness per se. And it was, of course, as we were saying before, a prestige in the imperial romanity of such Constantinopolitan bride. For example, Hugh Capet, king of the Western Franks, also sought a Byzantine princess for his son and heir, the future Robert II, so-called the Saint, in 988. Right, so it was becoming somehow fashionable, and again, it's not much of a random choice. It's just, again, the European and Mediterranean circuits reactivating, right? More blood is being pumped in the veins of the civilization, these empires that are expanding, and more international ties, and obviously the ones with what was still out there as the Roman Empire, given that the Ottonian equivalent was a novelty, again, in the romanity of the same, in spite, of course, of the older presence of a Roman conception of the Frankish Imperium per se, but still not so openly institutionally claimed as the Ottonians would do for the first time. Gerbert of Aurillac was esteemed by Otto III for his advice, for his enormous culture. Made a video about him, future Pope Sylvester II. And the emperor expressed the desire that Gerbert would bring out, quote, his Greek exactitude while banishing Saxon rusticity. Literally, Graeciska subtilitas and Saxonica rusticitas. This is quite interesting because, first of all, as you know, Gerbert had nothing to do with the Byzantines, but he was essentially from Auvergne, and so a Visigoth in practice, and very influenced, of course, by the Hellenic Arab literature that was stemming from the Caliphate of Cordoba. That was again after Constantinople, the other great court in Europe, an enormous pool of, in fact, of science, knowledge, and notions. And it's interesting that Otto would consider Gerbert in this sense as being, in his culture, somehow owning a an Hellenic legacy of some sort, which is fair because objectively, from a scientific point of view, and so this kind of orthodoxy that he was, so it was, as you know, a pretty rational concept dating to, in fact, ancient Hellenic philosophy, while Saxon rusticity here was stressing in fact, the warlikeness, the just almost the barbaric nature of the Saxons in this. And it's interesting because, of course, in Otto III lived essentially both German, Saxon, as a matter of fact, and Byzantine blood at the same time. So this preference is surely expressed by Otto, as he was pretty much aware of what the value of culture and of the orthodoxy for the sake of a Catholic empire to be established, right? As we've seen, Germanic would essentially bring the church to the next step of properly a universalistic awareness in that same imperial ambition. And we can argue that that's how, in fact, the Gregorian reforms, the investiture controversy were born at an ideological level, the deepest universalism of the Ottonian imperial ideology. And Otto was very, very motivated. He, even as a young man, as an adolescent, still, as a matter of fact, had a pretty clear idea of the holy man's mission to spread the gospel on earth. And of course, as emperor, and feeling deeply the legacy deriving both from his Germanic and Byzantine background, the first need to conform to these higher standards. As you know, Otto III was pretty close to Adalbert of Prague, a figure, a saint of truly European scale because of his connections with Central Europe, with Italy, with Otto III, with the Christianization of the Baltic, where he was martyrized, as a matter of fact. Adalbert had become Otto's spiritual father in 996, and he seems to have instilled the young emperor the longing for a spiritual regeneration that laid at the root of, in fact, the dream of the Golden Age that Augustan Rome had re-established, and that thus Otto felt compelled to recreate, as we will see better. And Adalbert's martyrdom by the Prussians in 997 was probably a very impacting event for the same Otto's spirituality, right? That, in fact, began to yearn ever more for personal salvation in that transfigurational dilemma, let's say, of the hero, in fact, of the greatest ruler of all, the emperor himself, who was to aim at this achievement, this reconnection with God through the apotheosis in the wake of the Augustan and Romulian tradition, the sacrality of kings, that he will use an ideology also against, in order to curb further papal interference in lay affairs, as we will see now, and embodying, of course, the imperial resurrection. It's very interesting how he probably felt the kind of the redeeming power of the Imperium. For example, he joined with Boleslav I of Poland, Boleslav the Brave, so-called, in the veneration of Adalbert, personally laying the relics of the saint on the altar of Gniezno's cathedral in the year 1000. These are the same years, again, which Hungary and Poland are secured by the Church of Rome in one of the greatest successes in medieval Christendom. And the emperor, it's as if the emperor had laid the foundation of this Christian social expansion by participating to such ceremonies. Otto was under the influence of other spiritual fathers, we can say. For example, a group of hermits that gravitated around Saint Romuald, who was an Italian hermit monk that he met in Rome in 1000. And that was also a friend with Saint Nilus, other most important probably, at least during Otto's maturity, spiritual figure at the time. This was essentially a Calabrian Byzantine, right? So he belonged to those Italians of essentially Greek culture and language of the coastal south. In fact, Saint Nilus had moved from Rossano, from a monastery near Gaeta, it's just south of Rome, and was urged by Otto to come and take charge, essentially, of any monastery he might wish in Rome. So, an incredible power that, as you understand, was also pretty political in nature at this point, because the Roman noble families kind of hegemonized that kind of ecclesiastical system at the same point, and they were, in fact, as we will see now, the main problem for ruling the city. Nilus was later visited by Otto, who on that occasion is said to have wept and placed his crown in the old man's hands upon departing from the Urbs, which was a very painful experience. There is a beautiful letter from Otto to the Romans that says, you have been elected by God to be essentially the center of the world and all this thing. Why don't you want me? That's basically the essence. Of course, much more solemn way, but that was the problem of pulling the string, and too much. And don't think that the Byzantines in this sense were not behind that too, because he was still a Germanic emperor, and the Constantinopolitans were playing on a Roman policy to kind of, but they probably knew that Otto would have not had on the longer run too much success in a city that was always the single most difficult thing to govern. But in virtue of this leverage on the imperial mechanism, Nilus was, again, a very close figure to Otto. They spoke very freely, considered that Otto had at least a reading knowledge of Greek, so probably he could or would understand Nilus if he had spoken just in Greek himself. This naturally helped probably also as a linguistic exercise, and probably opened Otto to some kind of broader understanding of Byzantine culture, semantics, whatever. And in this sense, it's interesting that nobody from Theophanes' retinue actually emerged as a major counselor in the Ottonian court, let alone a special spiritual advisor in general to the young Otto himself, right? So the impression that we get here is that the young emperor was very much influenced by probably the Roman milieu, and thus an Italian Byzantine, at least through the Byzantine influence that could arrive to Rome, especially from the south. Rome was always a cosmopolitan city, and there were Byzantine, also Syrian elements that had escaped historically from the iconoclasm, etc. But there were also Franks, in fact, Saxons, also Anglo-Saxons, as a matter of fact. So it wasn't just that. To just say that, however, some of the most cultured elements coming from the east at the time would be very in sight in Rome at the court, and because of also the imperial connection, or the connection with Byzantine held areas that probably Otto wanted to reconquer as well. So the Byzantines there were bringing high culture. Rome, also in its Latin dimension, had a magnificent one in that sense. But again, the Byzantine fil rouge for Otto was functional to the true universalism of its rule. So it was preferred in a way, and in fact, the Latin element, the Roman nobility, was he said something very, very different in that regard, and would see things in a much more kind of local ambition point of view. The only, let's say, Greek figure that was at least favored by Theophanu at a point, and that had a special role in Otto's policy, didn't come from Constantinople. It hadn't to do with the retinue of the princess, but again from southern Italy. We're talking about John Philagathus, that educated Otto as his godson in Greek for several years. John Philagathus would become literally Chancellor of the Italic Kingdom. He had an enormous prestige, so much that he would be made actually anti-pope, but by whom? By the same Romans, because of course, there was some Byzantine influence in Rome politically behind this choice, but it was also a way to properly look at a prestigious figure that had partly been involved, as we've seen, in the administration of Italy. Considered that between 989 and 990, he in fact ruled from Pavia, right? He was responsible for some important, let's say, reforms that were tending to discourage some local nobiliar ambitions to retake essentially the Italic crown for themselves. And you know that at Otto's death, we've seen it just, we're talking about Verona recently, the Italic nobility rose again, right, to claim properly the kingship. And there were expeditions of Henry II later on, and it was a pretty complicated time. We'll see in detail at some other point. But this had happened, in fact, because Otto had been expelled from Rome. So at that point, this John Philagathus was used like as a pawn by the Roman nobility, the Italic aristocracy, to kind of push forward that kind of anti-Ottonian policy, right? And this makes you reflect on how locally this establishment was in charge of the situation, how complicated it was to rule over the Italic kingdom and Rome even more. John was sent in Constantinople also to negotiate the marriage alliance for Otto. John returned to the Western Empire in late 996 with a Greek envoy. It was Leo of Synada. And this is the moment when Otto III's appointee Pope Gregory V was dislodged from Rome, and he became Pope himself, right? And this is interesting because John had previously been, still in Ottonian times, patronized by Crescentius, right? The Crescentii were actually the single most powerful noble family in Rome. There are still buildings dating to the 10th century, or some pretty much on the forum European art at the time, that belonged to these individuals. And Otto had Crescentius beheaded, right? John was eventually blinded, deposed, and paraded around Rome, right, seated back to a front on a donkey in the spring in 998. Leo of Synada was accused to have backed, in fact, John's elevation to Peter's throne. And, of course, much of the support had come from the Crescentii, but it was evident there that essentially he was a Constantinopolitan agent in Rome, and that had somehow maintained the contacts with his homeland in this whole anti-Ottonian rebellion in the urbs. This experience taught Otto not to trust any Byzantine Italian anymore, even though he had, as we've seen, been very attached to St. Nicholas. He had actually relied successfully on John Philagatus as an administrator, but he realized that his Byzantineness, right, also was incompatible on the longer run with his essentially Western Roman role, and thus he would somehow stick more to the Latin Germanic element from there on, because the Byzantines would always kind of threaten the same Italian positions of the Germans. In 1000, after his visit to Adalbert's shrine, Otto III had Charlemagne's remains at Aachen exhumed. Right, so think about the reflection on this, on the predecessor, because as you know, Charlemagne would be seen as the true renovator imperi, as opposed to actually Otto I himself. On this occasion, Otto III had Charlemagne's body laid on Byzantine silks, evidently acting here as a heir of the same Charlemagne, but still maintaining the awareness on kind of a Roman model of power. Right, that was, as we've seen, extremely useful to reinforce the Germanic autocracy on thanks to this model provided by the Byzantines. That was practically unattainable by standards, but could push harder toward that direction in the West. At this point, Otto thought even of making Aachen his most favored residence in the north, but he would eventually choose Rome because he realized that there was essentially no other place to better stress his political and divine prerogatives at a level. Consider that both Aachen and Rome were, in a sense, at the periphery of his lands. Right, Aachen had been founded by Charlemagne to emulate, at least in large palatium, properly the Roman splendor, but historically would remain kind of symbolically important also for the imperial, usually actually the Roman crowning, because as you know, in fact, the imperial crowning was in Rome, but it still embodied, of course, that imperial grandeur because of Charlemagne's legacy. But it wouldn't have like a crucial important. I mean, cities like Cologne, Mainz, Frankfurt, Trier, and Regensburg were kind of more important in Germany. Otto determined, in effect, to abandon this absentee lordship of Rome, as his presence could solve, hopefully, most problems deriving from this central city, right? Consider that Otto I or Otto II had not sojourned in Rome, had not governed from Rome, right? So their goals had been different, even though Otto II, as we've seen, had spotted the core importance of Roman symbolism. But Otto was coming permanently to Rome to make of it the royal city. This traditionally was a very specific goal regarding the opposition to the papal self-proclaimed apostolic status, right, and also to curb the kind of the unruliness of the Roman nobility. Why the royal city? Because the regnum, right, in the Roman pagan tradition was overlapping the sacerdotium. In other words, the split that had occurred in the West between the lay authority and the ecclesiastical authority, temporal power, and spiritual power were not known, as you know, in the ancient Augustan model, right? The same Byzantine model had fundamentally remained about this. It was the emperor to be the vicar of Christ on earth, right? And then the Patriarchate of Constantinople was subjected to the emperor. In the West, instead, as you know, the split had occurred, and you know what I think about it fundamentally, but it's still remarkable that Otto decided to reinforce. This was seen, of course, as the original imperial prerogative of being able to dispose unitarily of both universal power, right? In other words, seeking for a divine like status, almost, right? Maybe in a covert way, mostly an apostolic one, publicly, but still believing in that kind of Germanic mentality where kind of power was more directly connected with the divine bond without any medium in practice. I will digress on this topic on another occasion, but bear in mind what happened to the Byzantine Empire as opposed to the West, right? Historically. So we can hardly think of this split, this kind of provocative interaction, alliance between mutually provocative one between the papacy and the empire as actually one of the single most successful mechanisms in the history of mankind, because the sheer civilizational output that came out of the investiture struggle, I don't think could have been compensated by the overlapping of the temporal and spiritual authority in a single office, right? But I don't have time to explain it in detail now. In any case, there was a Byzantine influence, in fact, because the Constantinopolitan emperors thought of their city as the reigning one. So literally as if, in this case, Rome had been reigning herself in the empire. And here, of course, there is the ultimate purpose of centralizing the empire from Rome, which was essentially the objective of any other Germanic emperor that could afford like a full rule in Italy, so known practically, but the objective was that one, and that's why constantly the Germans needed that, not just imperial crowning, but that opportunity to centralize for a much more kind of stately, advanced, kind of administratively ordered, and also per capita wealthier, kind of more manageable reality, plus in the center of Mediterranean with much more resources. I mean, an advantage that cannot be stressed enough, right? An advantage that would have been greater than the one of Constantinople, arguably, at least on a larger scale, for what it would have entailed if it had succeeded to be permanently established. And it's not a coincidence that Otto chose as his residence the Palatine Hill, right? So the Romulan center, so the center of the guy who had not just founded Rome herself, but had divinely transfigured as a holy Roman emperor by definition, right? So not just the place of the Caesar's palaces and where the Domus Augustana, where, as we will see, Otto would build other from within, also erecting other even spiritual structures and so on, but properly the symbol of that new Olympus, of that again traditional Indo-European fact mountain from which the hero comes closer to God, right? In the Saturnia Tellus, where again the Golden Age had been representated, so with an emanating prestige that was actually superior to the one of Constantinople herself, just traditionally, and not just because of the church, but because of Rome herself. And there was a lot of clerical activity at this point around Otto, because that was his point as well, controlling the church. I think that up to 65 diplomata were issued in or near Rome under his supervision between May 996 and February 1001. And two of them expressly state the expression that these documents had been issued in Palatio Monasterio, right? So literally in a sort of new Asgard, where literally the lay and ecclesiastical power coexisted in one, in Otto himself. That's the sacred royalty that he was talking about. And more concretely, these charters refer probably about the adjoining monastery of Saint Caesarius on the Palatine that doesn't exist anymore, but we know this was a monastery founded in the 4th century, and there are some aspects remains dating from the 8th century, so we know at the time was active, and being just on the Palatine was used. And probably also, like, there is not much left, at least of the entire structure as could be before, but especially internally, because it disappeared much later, telling the truth. But it's relevant that that would become the seat of also of the imperial clerical policy, right, where this diplomata were actually issued from. Because Otto's court literally laid there, right, and for quite lengthy stretches from 998. Consider that this somehow opposed the papal legitimacy deriving from the donation of Constantine, because the concept there was that literally the emperor had entrusted the Bishop of Rome with the government of the Eternal City, and now Otto was simply ruling her at the same, in the same way, the same equivalent. So that there was some ambiguity regarding this donation historically, how it was made up. It was constructed cleverly by the papacy to express a situation that existed de facto, and that of course was part of the Roman tradition and beyond. And this wouldn't put by itself an end to the broader problem of the coexistence, but also the conflict next to the cooperation between temporal and spiritual power. And the interesting aspect of this is that before Otto III, there was no recent precedent for such a large-scale secular court in Rome, and definitely not in this kind of permanent profile that Otto had wanted to take. Of course, Charlemagne had been there, Louis the Pious had been there. There were times in which the Franks had controlled the city proper, but you know how the thing ended on the longer run. And so Otto was actually to experience the same problem. But there was naturally an advantage for Rome, because citizens were at this point acquainted with the luxury products and the authority symbols of the emperors, whether they were Germanic or Byzantine conceptually, right? Rome had maintained always that centrality, was the capital of Western culture, had connections with the entire Europe. So it seemed appropriate, and also kind of, especially from the majority of the people, that this authority would pick Rome as his residence. The nobility, as we've seen, had a bit more problem, because those were the ones more habituated to actually rule the city, and this seems like a bit like the ancient struggle between the Roman nobility and the Etruscan kings that were making leverage on the plebs. As we will see, there was an important religious symbology too that Otto was using to exploit, especially support from the lower classes. And much of this will also charter issuing was part of the Roman literary practice, right? Italy was much more documentarily habituated, much more literate, so say issuing diplomata to assess like properly the control on the city, on the empire, seemed to be again also a pretty effective way to rule, formally officializing further the value of the content and so on. And Otto on this occasion invested dramatically also in the emulation of the Byzantine court ritual and ceremonies. Rome presented an impressive amount of buildings, of sacred places, of infrastructure to carry out right in front of the people such magnificent spectacles that were meant to again mirror that divine order that the Byzantines had so strictly codified, that Otto had, even through his mother and more, come to know in its effectiveness, in its solemnity, and so on. And as you know, the Byzantines were also extravagant by Latin Germanic standards. So, of course, as we've seen, the Roman nobility was unhappy by the foe. The people probably was more supportive even of these palace ceremonies and street parades. Think about the spectacles in the Forum. Just think of how Rome could be in the 10th century. Consider that many monuments of the classical past were also much more kind of splendidly arranged compared to today, after the spoliations for the construction of equally spectacular buildings in medieval and Renaissance times, but at the same time not close to the original, especially the imperial original that Otto cared about so much, right? And the Palatine seemed also quite appropriate exactly to win both that kind of lay and ecclesiastical dimension in the city. We find in Otto's Diplomata some official titles that resemble, actually copy the Byzantine ones linguistically. The Logothetes and the Protospatarius especially. In 998, Otto began to call his chancellor for Italy, that at the time was Heribert, Cancellarius et Logoteta, or Archilogoteta in the same documents. The title Protospatarius had, as you know, that in the Byzantine titling there were names that had kind of very different original corresponded to very original functions etymologically than the ones that they actually carried out. So Protospatarius was actually the equivalent of the Latin comes palazzi in Italy, right? So this broader administrator of the royal, in this case imperial palace. And the interesting fact about these names is that some came even from what the contemporary civilian administration of Rome had maintained. For example, the title Imperialis Palazzi Magister that appears in Otto's own coinings. So a mix, again, of what could be brought as a sort of Byzantine imitation and kind of local Latin names that Romans had been using for administering the city. Of course, through these titles that start appearing mainly from the documents issued in or after 998, the imperial titling affirmed further Otto's legitimacy as the emperor, but also the palace-based master of Rome, right? Also from the year 1000, Otto experimented with his own title, depending on where he would travel, right? Both north or south of the Alps, right? We know a few about the ceremonial practice in the palace. We know, for example, the Libellus de Ceremoniis, Aule Imperatoris, that, however, is a 12th century work of Peter the Diacons, who had been very fascinated with classical Rome. You know, the 12th century is called like the medieval Renaissance by some degree, but he had based himself on some Ottonian material, especially 3 protocols that date exactly to Otto III's reign. And there is a very eloquent feature of this ceremonial palace that entailed Otto's elevation at dinner above all the other guests, practically. That was a typical practice of the Basileus at certain banquets, at least in Constantinople. That literally saw the throne like rising up above anybody else, and also the whole atmosphere was somehow crystallized in that perfect order. The emperor had just to move in a particular way. There is a hieratic, in fact, nature of this power, because as we've seen, the emperor was literally Christ's vicar on earth from a Byzantine perspective, and this would be paradoxically motivated further not much from the Byzantine influence, but properly from the awareness that the full control, the perfection, the apparent lack of emotions was the hallmark of imperial power. So that still, I don't know, in Philip IV or Boniface VIII's time, it's said that, I don't know, Philip IV would never say anything during the meetings, would never blink, would always be like a statue, right? Because that was how the imperturbability of the universal order that had just to have sorted all out before without kind of losing self-control in any way, even in physical movement by a degree. And it's very scenographic and interesting to think that this happened also in Otto's times, like this elevated throne or above the dining table. Of all other, with guests were very illustrious figures for the time, and on the Palatine Hill in Rome. It's powerful, right? You don't hear it often, but this happened too. We hinted before at Otto's connection with the plebs, if you want, as an emperor, that, as you know, was a leitmotif of properly of the imperial autocracy back in the day. It was important also, in fact, in Constantinople and in ancient Roman times. The idea that the nobility is always the most dangerous element, and that you, as a sole ruler, you want to flatten basically the oligarchy, because that's dangerous, right? And the people instead feel that the emperor is working for them by countering essentially their masters in the form of the aristocrats. For this reason, Otto resumes in Rome, especially, or at least promotes particularly, the cult of the Virgin as protectress of Rome, and actually as Rome herself. It's a bit like the symbol of the Magna Mater, the great Pelasgian female goddess that somehow had always been, the favorite deity of the lower classes, right, all over Europe, whereas the nobility mostly looked at a virile, martial, Uranic figure, right? As you can see also in Rome. And Otto III commissioned even a hymn to the Virgin that sounded like Sancta Dei Genetrix Romanam Respice Plebem, right? So it is Holy Mother of God, look after the Roman people. The plebs here is very specific terminology. So you understand the political aim of it. And this is even more extraordinary, thinking that Otto preferred to associate the city with the Virgin rather than with St. Peter and St. Paul. So, in a sense, diminishing the power of the church. The same thing was done in Constantinople, interestingly enough. Like the fact that the Virgin was protecting the plebs, even though Constantinople, as you know, was complex because truly no apostle had ever been connected with it, so Constantine had to bring literally the relics of so many apostles, bringing in Constantinople to confer her some prestige in that regard. So Rome was actually instead the top ever because of St. Peter's and St. Paul, aside from all the other, the former sacrality, in a broader Catholic sense. And the hymn was chanted through Rome's streets by the Greek school, that is to say the Byzantine guild of the city, on the vigil of the Assumption in 1000. This may have been also a way to win over the Byzantine element that, as we've seen, had been also somehow unloyal to Otto the point, and that, however, could be played on against the Latin majority to counterbalance power. And still fueling this greater autocracy that was coming through the Byzantine channel to embody the emperor. And we don't know at the time even how many Greek speakers there were in Rome. Like, again, we mostly think that there was probably an over-representation of the same, but this seemed to have been a significant presence, mostly through the call of some Italian Byzantines from, in fact, the south rather than from Constantinople. So drawing, again, from a peninsular background that was the one, as we will see now, that Otto tried to Germanize, even though not really having the possibility at that point. There were even Byzantine forms of punishment and degradation for the rebels, such as the one that we have observed against Philagathus, as typical, right, making the guy riding the donkey backwards, which literally means, see, the donkey is the symbol of the Dionysian, of the Chthonic, of the servile, of the slave, right? And you ride it backwards, so you're not a rider, you're not a horseman, you're not a knight. You're not anyone. It was essentially an emasculation, sort of castration. You were good for nothing as a man. That was the concept. As you can understand, in all this, north of the Alps, the mentality was quite different. As we've seen, the German nobility was actually the one more sympathetic to the Byzantine models there. The majority of people probably didn't even perceive what was happening at the highest spheres for the reasons that we have explained before. But for the German nobility, instead, the Byzantine element wasn't felt like a threat to the nobility, so to them at all, but quite like the contrary. The emperor, that after all was ruling in Italy, he traveled also in Central Europe. Of course, he administered Germany as well, but in a way was just sending them the reward for their loyalty. And so those same Byzantine artifacts, models, etc., were functional to the increase of their prestige. Right. First of all, they liked luxuries, and you know that elites are the most sensible to kind of international influence, personal aggrandizement, and so on. Right. The sense the Germanic elites had always been particularly sensitive to the Roman artifacts, the Mediterranean handicrafts, and so on, as this would distinguish them from the rest of the people as aristocrats, right? And so showing the prestige, the wealth, etc. Thinking that, in the sense of, again, of alleged Germanic freedom, that actually the Germanic nobility was quite quick in Ottonian times to adopt, especially the particular of the Byzantine proskynesis. So literally the kneeling in front, in this case not of the emperor, but the essentially kneeling of your clients, of your subjects, of your serfs, as a nobleman. In fact, to yourself. So strengthening further that kind of essentially lack of public authority administration, but just this private rule of single noblemen over the rest of the people. And again, reflect about this, because generally speaking, when we think about, say, this Middle Ages as the idea of, I don't know, maybe the Germans that come and rule over the South, whatever, it was the other way around as far as the political and social practice was concerned, because, again, in Italy, traditionally, people were free. And the wealth distribution ensured this. This was a much more, as we've seen, urban-based, literate, kind of centrally administered system where people literally participated to that. In Germany, again, it was all a great lordship. And you couldn't practically evade that. There weren't other institutions, I don't know, entities, structures of any kind who could say, okay, well, I kind of coexist as a true freeman. The concept did not exist because the boundaries had not been established, the standards had not been established. So just who had risen to power through the essentially degradation of the freemen would feel, in fact, legitimized by God to rule, which is essentially what the same emperors do comparatively. So very different from the migration era where, say, the Roman eras were somehow populated by colonists, and Central Europe was mostly like ruled by freemen that, however, still were already under, especially at that point, under the military clientele of bigger bosses, let's say. And because of that previous, in fact, lack of settled structures, what you have at the thresholds of the second millennium is exactly this. Again, a switched reality. Right? So the proskynesis there is quite eloquent, because it's a more orientalizing influence, as you know, that existed since Alexandrian times, but by from Persian origin. And the Persians, in that sense, had established that exactly through that Indo-European mentality of the unrestrained lordship and kind of warlike idea that the stronger needs to rule on the weaker, and so that there is no other balance, and however creating an imbalance within the same system. Authority symbols such as the laurus were assimilated from Constantinople by the Ottonian family as well. The stemmata crowns of Byzantine design retain a place among the insignia of Henry II, the Bavarian, that succeeded Otto, while other items were part of the broader universal God-given power command, as the orb, right? The eagle, which is the dove at some point. At least the symbology is mixed here, but it's always the Holy Ghost / victory / imperium, that together with the globe, like the idea of the universe as such, and the cross on it were the proof of, in fact, divine sanction of your power. There was much activity in Otto's reign, as we've seen also towards the Slavic northeast, especially Gnezno, that with Saint Adalbert had acquired such a prestigious role as a sanctuary. And Otto's relation with Boleslav the Brave is especially interesting, because as we were saying before, it's as if there had been almost a shared imperium, right? Otto called Boleslav literally brother and partner of the empire, right? And friend and ally of the Roman people, right? Fratrem et cooperatorem imperii. populi Romani amicum et socium, right? This is at least told us by the anonymous Gallus. And this aspect is probably influenced by the Byzantine practice of crown transfer that is in fact witnessed in Byzantine literature, albeit only once, right? But it was normal there by the Basileus to appoint a Caesar personally. So we have seen this in Byzantine history for what the emperors do with, I don't know, the Bulgarians, with the Rus, right? For peoples that they wanted essentially to incorporate within their own empire, but that were also somehow autonomous and even dangerous by some degree. Well, Otto seems to be doing the same exactly in this patronizing policy with Poland. And naturally, Boleslav is, as a single ruler in Poland, is greatly elevated by this. We will look at his reign. I made a video about Poland roughly against during the same period, but we'll have to see Boleslav's reign a bit more in detail. So Boleslav was perceived like a sort of primus inter pares. The idea, a bit like the same Byzantine idea towards the Westerners, Constantinople had recognized Charlemagne's imperium. So, especially considering that these were Christian rulers now, it was obvious that as long as Christianity, as far as Christianity went, the empire had to be represented there. But it's as if there had been a broader universal hierarchy that revolved around the emperor that emanated imperium, and so these guys that were worthy would be co-opted to be part of this great system. As you know, Poland would actually remain out of the Holy Roman Empire, whereas Bohemia, for example, was literally integrated within an institutional system as it kind of statelized as a sort of country or some of specific country. But in Otto III's time, the project was pan-European, as you understand. Otto presented Boleslav with a gilded lance. For the Franconians, it was a holy lance, perhaps inspired to the Constantinian symbology in Constantinople. So, of course, the lance was holy just even in the pagan, Germanic, and Slavic tradition, right? Actually, it was more important than the sword originally. And it had the same kind of imperial redeeming value because slaves were freed by being tipped with the lance and becoming freemen in the process, because if they had proven to own the imperium in combat by God's trial. So that was also a shared meaning, probably, that the Germans and the Slavs could quite understand well, also because there was, especially across the frontier for hundreds of kilometers, even no clear understanding who was Slav, who was Germanic by many ways. Thus, Otto's political requirement of virtus was very military based as well, right? The virtus is the sum of the warrior's ability in the ancient Latin ethos, right? So it cannot be achieved but through the divine grace earned on the battlefield. So it's actually not very different from what the Romans, that secularized and modernized at a point, called like the Führer, like in a lesser sense, more pertaining to the barbarians, because they saw it as indisciplined, but it was actually kind of the same in principle. I mean, the idea that you must have virtus and discipline at the same time to say discipline as this kind of more modern secular, also mental category, but that could not exclude each other. Instead, in countries like Central Europe, of course, what we call the Virtus or the Führer as an equivalent in the local language was still kind of the same. So of course, the Slavic frontier was pretty bloody. These peoples basically didn't understand any other language but the one of steel, and so everything was measured, tested, and practiced politically through the sword. Thietmar of Merseburg voices the incomprehension and the dissatisfaction of some northerners when they described Otto's aim as being to revive, quote, the ancient customs of the Romans now largely destroyed, antiquam Romanorum consuetudinem iam ex parte magnam delectam, right? And the reason being what we were referring to before regarding especially the Romanity of the empire, as opposed to what the Saxons mostly thought belonged to them. But they weren't realizing in turn, in a modern secular sense, that the national attachment is actually the declaration of failure of imperial power, and in fact divine transfiguration. So it's as if the world had already been running towards, again, the decline of universalism and the rise of nations, so this gradual disgregation toward the abyss, because objectively, there was a political intelligence behind this, because again, here, also the German nobility, of course, felt threatened by the emperor, right? So those would be the ones who would start to kind of nurture some kind of doubt also about this authority, because they probably in part they didn't see it as truly hegemonic. As we were saying at the beginning, there were important limits to the Ottonian Empire, both in Germany and abroad. But also because just resistance was due. Like, if you can resist these authorities, because in part you, by that degree of power that you display, you do receive God's support, because the emperors do not have to be unchallenged to remain functional, right? And that's why also the Byzantines had it kind of worse, and the Latin Germanic war probably emerged in a much more effervescent way, even though the two universal powers were split in the process. So these are very interesting aspects to investigate, because always think that Otto had his own Saxon elements, the guard, etc., and you could guess what kind of the average Saxon warrior traditionally thought about this whole Byzantine Roman fashion, which surely didn't seem to him particularly manly, and nor reflecting the ancient true core harshness of the Saxon military that had earned the Imperium, in fact. And so now that the Imperium had to be disposed of, there were different opinions on how it had to be handled, right? First of all, the Saxons were, but probably also the Germans entirely, were disappointed of Otto's decision to maintain his residence in Rome. Especially as a young ruler, this was perceived as he's being just brainwashed by his kind of Romano-Byzantine advisors. However, there was a refinement of Otto's ideology throughout this whole process that went actually towards an ever greater Romanity of power, exactly because of the necessity of enforcing this absolute capacity, this display of force. First of all, consider that a weak ruler that would have been just simply conservatively staying home and not reviving power in Italy would have never been recognized as highly as Otto was. For example, at some point just before his marriage, his same supporters thought that Otto would have been perceived as too weak in the West to receive a Porphyrogenita princess as a spouse. However, Constantinople agreed a few years later and sent this daughter Zoe of Constantine VIII, who landed in Bari in Apulia, probably in February-March of 1002. And Zoe is the same one that eventually would rule. I mean, she's famous. We discussed her recently because she was actually betrothed to Otto, but when she landed in Italy, he had already died. And consider that if this marriage had succeeded, Otto and Zoe had had children, the entire history of the West and the East would have changed in many ways. First of all, this would have set precedent for in fact, the constant union, dynastic union at least, of the East and the West. Because Constantine VIII was a legal emperor, right? Theophano hadn't been the daughter of, she was actually just related to an usurper. So this marriage would have sealed an incredible amount of legitimacy for the Western Empire. It may have even continued the Italian policy further. So we cannot know what would have happened, because the 11th century eventually was just so random. You need the way the Gregorian reforms happened, etc. So there may have been literally a restoration of some sort of Roman Empire. In fact, the same Gerberto of Aurillac, that at that point was Pope with the meaningful name of Sylvester II. So the Pope of Constantine the Great had signaled Otto, upon becoming Pope in 999, that the Ottonian, in fact, was a new Constantine himself, right? And at that point, how would have dynastically things gone? Because of course the Byzantines and the Germans had two different types of succession system, two different types of politics, of society, as we've seen. But just imagine, for example, the prestige that a Constantinian aura would have had from the Ottonian side on the newly evangelized peoples in Eastern Europe. Imagine Otto and Zoe have lots of children, lots of male heirs. Well, you ensure there a dynastic continuity that can even ask, say, if something at the Byzantine court goes wrong, like, we are actually the true emperors now. And so the allegiance, even of all these peoples in Central and Eastern Europe, could have switched further in favor of Rome. And even with some aggression towards the Byzantine Empire, because we will see in another video that there were moves, also military ones, against the integrity of the Byzantine territories, at least in some frontier areas, and as we'll see, not even with great success, because again the Ottonians had these broader problems of mass of keeping Germany and Italy together. It was really hard, and it required these Italian expeditions north of the Alps. You had to convince the German vassals. It was a total mess, right? But again, from this, paradoxically, in the West, we managed to develop something that went beyond in terms of effectiveness and efficiency, even what the Byzantine state already was. Actually, is a pretty remarkable system statally wise, but this was surpassed in a more kind of complex but propulsive way by the Westerners. There was a poem composed soon after Gregory V's return to Rome in 998, describing Otto as essentially receiving the subservience of both Greece and the Muslims. Right? It says that the so-called golden Greece, so the color of the gods, gold, the essence of the gods, the Dorian order established, Hellenic times, and the Muslims as enemies of the faith. So here you see essentially heaven and hell, right? Would fear Otto, so as God himself, and would have served him with necks bowed, right? You're probably seeing here in the pictures Otto's Evangeliarium, in which there is Sclavinia, Gallia, Germania, and Roma, that all bring tributes to Otto, right? As 4 women that all bring their own type of national tribute, right? And so the imperial ideology here was ferocious, right? And no other dynasty ever carried out to this propulsory and classical degree the imperial cultural construction as the Ottonians did, right, in medieval Western Europe. It set in fact, a base that would be remembered forever, like the great emperors Charlemagne, Otto I, and Frederick Barbarossa. Eventually, even in late Middle Ages, are always there. The symbol of, eventually in those centuries, mostly as a sort of proto-nationalistic German kind of mentality, right? But unavoidably, this very Ottonians that were stressing the Romanity of the empire, because that also was actually a title that the Germans bore. Like if you look at during the 13th century, literally the German knights, the German public was obsessed. The idea is that there is a Roman emperor, and we are the Romans. Like the German battle cry in battles like Markfeld, etc., was "Here's Rome." And it's interesting, at that time they weren't even they weren't even in Italy. So just think how impacting the Roman Catholicism, imperially wise, was for these people, and how much this prestige was sought after since such early times, since ever, because you can trace this as back as the times in which the Germanic auxilia served in the Roman army. They were exalted by that, of serving under the true divine rule and being elevated to freedom by earning citizenship, etc. So this is millenary dynamic in Europe that deeply affected and molded these entire countries. It would be interesting to see also how much that ideology from the West affected the Byzantines, because they were kind of more reactionary and xenophobic, as you know, but they somehow did grasp something about the original meaning also, what they were trying to impart, even to obscure, because it would have been unfavorable to their alleged unique kind of monopoly of Romanity, which was hardly so. But we were seeing it just the other day in that video about Manuel I Comnenus, still the commixtion, and that you can find here between the two sides in the project of a greater rule, both sides of the Mediterranean and also in Europe, like was deeply affecting their politics, their way of thinking, the way they related with other powers, etc. So the dream was still very alive, especially until the 14th century, especially for the West at that point. Mostly the peak was the 12th, the early 13th again, as the great revival of the imperial ideology, starting from these very centuries. This poem that we were referring to about Golden Greece and the Muslims fearing Otto and serving him with necks bowed was chanted at a festival in Rome. Mm. And this speaks clearly in the second phase of the challenge posed to Byzantine claims as the sole continuators of the Imperium Romanum. And so the only possible, the only legitimate earthly authority. So here's the full display of Otto's God-given majestas. As we've seen, there was an interest in winning over also the Roman population and even the aristocracy, even if they were opposed to him. But of course, there was room to play within one, and especially the experiment of making of Rome again the urbs regia, so the city of a ruler that owns both the regnum and the sacerdotium, traditionally, was probably seen already by the Byzantines as, an exaggeration. There is an anxiety from the Ottonian side to boast these prerogatives, but also they probably knew Rome much better than the Ottonians in a way, at least in a broader cultural sense, for believing would succeed. After all, Otto had to go away from Rome in 1001 because of the rebellions, right? And the Byzantines that were around were surely passing Rome through this spies, merchants, men of letter, and so on, realized that, of course, things were not so easy as they seemed, and the relations between the papacy, consider the Ottonians controlled, had the greatest control in the papacy ever achieved by the Holy Roman Emperor, right? And the thing would deteriorate over time because the relations remained particularly intense, but they were still intermittent, right? They were mostly expeditions of the newly elected king of the Romans to just become emperor, but again, the resources to effectively maintain Germany or Italy altogether under control weren't there, right? And there were always factions. There were new powers growing in both countries that would challenge a unitary rule. So they never underestimate how unitary sometimes the resistance also was, and how, of course, this was intertwined with Papal one. Sylvester II here, say, while the Ottonian dynasty dies together with power, its incredible power, the Pope establishes properly the equivalent at an ecclesiastical level that, however, will last because the ecclesiastical institution is much more resistant and much more, directly based on that Roman legacy. Properly, I'm talking about the city of Rome, political, culture, administration, art, like the entire knowledge coming from classical past that had been preserved locally by manuscripts, etc., but the context with the same Constantinople, and so this constant revival, as we've seen, of documentary written practice, again, ruling a city. There was nothing like Rome north of the Alps, right? So it's a completely different reality. As far as the military expansion is concerned, like, is there an attempt by Otto III to kind of increase his control on Byzantine Italy in this process? Well, there is, and we will talk about it perhaps in another video because this one is very, very long. I'll just point out something that Otto waged a campaign into southern Italy in 999. It wasn't aimed at conquest, but just at kind of broader political testing, kind of an explorative foray, right, to see whether there were opportunities to concentrate to invest more resources in there. He arrived only as far as Benevento and Capua, that were most of these Longobard centers historically, as they had remained actually as this kind of buffer states between the Byzantines and the Italic kingdom, which they also theoretically were part, but Otto III had claimed on that occasion overlordship over the entire southern Italy. So the fact that he stopped basically there in Campania just tells how kind of, modest, after all, that effort really was. Eventually, Otto died in the following year, so the thing cannot be measured. But there were other interests in Venice, in the Balkans, and we have to see this in another video, because it will be a much more kind of politically, strategically based one. For today, I instead stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.